I'm Adam Warburton. I'm from Travelex. I'm head of mobile, so I'm responsible for building Travelex's mobile apps and mobile products. So I think to define a competitive product, you really have to understand the competitive landscape that the product operates within. So if we take something like Ford, for example, and cars, you could look at the competitive set and you could say it was other car manufacturers. So it was Ford, it was Mercedes, it was BMW. But actually, if you consider Ford and look at the job that Ford's doing, Ford is moving people from one place to another place. So actually you can begin to look at other competitors like trains, planes, walking or cycling. So when you begin to understand the competitive landscape a little bit wider like that, then all of a sudden what it means to be competitive is very different. So what it means to be competitive against other cars versus what it means to be competitive against rail or aeroplanes. So I think it's key to understand the whole of a competitive landscape, and then you can begin to build out KPIs based on the outcomes that customers want from using your product. So if we take, like say, Ford, for example, against other cars, we might look at fuel economy and we might look at other metrics like that. But against planes and rail, we might begin to look at time of the overall journey. We might want to look at comfort and things like that. So I think key to understanding a competitive product, first of all, is understanding the competitive landscape. I think the biggest challenge that I've had is probably over-interested stakeholders. So every product manager wants interested stakeholders. It's kind of what we want. We don't want people disinterested in our product. We want to make sure the whole of the organization is interested in what we're doing. But it can go too far sometimes where you have over-interested stakeholders who want to control every element of the product. They want to look at copy and button colors and the layouts and things like that. And I think the biggest way that we've overcome that is two things. First of all is just managing expectations. There's a reason that people are in different roles. It's because they have different skills in different areas. So the reason that we have a copywriter, for example, is to write the copy. So it doesn't mean that everyone should then have a say in that. But I think key is moving stakeholders away from talking about solutions. So moving them away from saying that button should be green, that button should be blue, we should do push notifications, we should do this feature, we should do that feature, and pushing stakeholders to start to talk about problems and customer problems and the problems that we're beginning to address. And all of a sudden that just shifts the dynamics of the group and you begin to talk about problems that you can solve, and then that gives the product team the air cover that they need to go and do the work that they can do with design and engineering teams. So the best piece of advice that I've been given has been around managing my own personal biases and managing any inertia that I might have. I think as a product manager, it's really easy to fall into the trap of, I think this is a good product, or I think this is a good idea, or I think this is a good feature, so we should go do it. If I think it's good, everyone will think it's good. And actually, it's incredibly important to manage those biases and be aware of your own biases. You have to be aware that every decision you make is influenced by the environment that you're in, the cultural background that you have, the team that you're with. And actually, when you begin to unpick all of the biases that go into a product, it makes it easier to manage them and try and manage them out. Ultimately, you're building your product for your customers. You're not building the product for yourself. And if you can manage biases and you can manage any inertia that you've got, then you'll manage to build a product that customers really want. So my favourite question to ask in an interview is, what is the candidate's favourite product? The reason that I like to ask that question is for a couple of reasons. The first reason is I'm just nosy. I want to kind of understand a little bit about them, their hobbies, what they're interested in. But when you get into the nuts and bolts of why it's their favourite product, you can begin to unpick different facets of product. So, why is it good? What metrics should it be hitting? Why is it a good product? Have they really thought through the customer needs? What job is it addressing? What are the outcomes that customers want? But then my favourite question off the back of that is, what feature would you remove from your favourite product? And that's pretty tough to answer, because in your favourite product, you usually enjoy a lot about it. And it might be really easy to say, here's the features that I would add to it. But actually removing a feature can be one of the hardest things that a product manager has to do. Often you become emotionally attached to products and features. So then to have to think about removing the feature can be pretty tough. And we've seen it with Apple recently in the iPhone 7. they removed the headphone jack from the iPhone 7, and that's not an easy decision to make. If they looked at the data and the analytics, they would have seen that almost all their customers were using this feature, but actually they're able to be a little bit more visionary, predict where the market might be moving to, and make tough decisions about removing features from products. I think it's really important in product culture to have a challenging culture. A culture where challenge is encouraged, it's embraced, and we all want to push one another. Ultimately, one product manager is one product manager, and as we discussed before, their thinking can be constrained by biases and other things, other environmental factors. And actually, creating a culture where you're challenged by other people fairly readily just pushes the product to the next level. All of a sudden, it's not one person's view, you're being challenged across a range of different people. Also, it makes you think through your product decisions even more, because you know that you're going to be challenged by other people. All of a sudden, you don't make sloppy decisions that are ill thought through, because you know that your peers are going to challenge you on what you're actually doing. So it's really important to create a culture where you're readily challenged and that's embraced by everybody. And I think key to doing that is transparency. You have to make sure that everything that people are doing is made transparent, the products that people are working on, the decisions that are being made, and that can then really drive that transparency. And then through transparency, you can then drive the challenge. People can only challenge what they know about. So if you have a lack of transparency, then you can't really drive a challenging culture. So for me, a good product manager has to be very balanced. Ultimately, they're going to be working with a number of different stakeholders and a number of different teams across an organization. They're going to be working with engineering, design, commercial functions, marketing functions, and a person has to be able to really tie all of those functions together. And as a part of that, you have to be able to translate. So you have to be able to talk tech and then translate that back to the business teams, and not bamboozle them with confusing jargon. But then you have to take all of the input from the business and commercial teams and then translate that back to the design teams and to the engineering teams. So ultimately, I always think of a product manager as someone that can speak a number of different languages, and that's the person that really ties the rest of the functions together. So being able to translate requirements from other functions is very, very important. But then I think it's also core to be able to operate at two different altitudes. So ultimately, a product manager runs the day-to-day running of the team. So they're involved in stand-ups and sprint planning and writing stories and firefighting any issues that come along. And it can be, intense, it can be hard work, but a product manager also has to be able to pull themselves out of that detail and gives themselves some headspace to be able just to think through, what's the vision of the product, where are we going, even down to what are we doing next week, what are we doing next month. And you have to be able to do that whilst being in the same office, in the same environment with the same people. So you have to be able to operate at different altitudes at different times depending on the requirements of the product and the role. So I think those two things give you a really good balance for a good product manager. So for me, I think ultimately product and design address very similar problems. They're both concerned with the customer and with the customer experience and with the product experience. And I think we'll begin to see product and design functionally align. So at Travelex, that's the move that we're making. We're now bringing our product teams and our design teams into the same function. But I think we'll see skill sets kind of align between the two. We're already seeing the advent of the product designer, designers that aren't specifically on the design team, they're embedded in product teams, they understand product requirements. And I think we also see product managers that are beginning to wireframe and they're beginning to have some grounding in UX. And I actually think we'll probably see a merger of the two roles. I know there's some organizations in London at the moment that have a product designer who is the product manager and the UX designer as a singular role, who will then work with a UI designer to kind of give you the full end-to-end product and design spectrum. So I think we'll begin to see the two functions merge, and as a part of that, the product skill set is going to have to expand into some elements of design. So traditionally, a product manager might look at KPIs for their product, and they might look around the outcomes that they're trying to serve for a customer. So then they construct KPIs to support that. Or they might look at the commercial KPIs that the business has, and then they'll build their KPIs to support that. But really, businesses need to take a more horizontal look across different products. If you go back to Sony in 2006, you see that Sony had very deep verticals in products. So they had a Warburton division, they had a cameras division, a TVs division, a phones division, and a gaming division. And ultimately, each of those products did the product manager classic thing of, I'm going to design my KPIs around my own product and how my own product should work. And ultimately, nobody saw that all of those products could be merged into one. And then when the iPhone came along, Sony had billions written off its value and thousands of people were made redundant because of the lack of foresight into that. And actually, if they'd have had horizontal KPIs, then that might have been one way that they could have begun to have pushed their thinking around that. Ultimately, people in the cameras team didn't care about how many phones were sold, and people in the TVs department didn't care about that. But if you can create a culture where everybody cares about the business strategy and pushing the business forward, then hopefully you can begin to have a little bit more foresight into how your products play against one another if you're in a portfolio style business. And ultimately, people have to remember that the product and its KPIs shouldn't be overly insular. It has to form a part of the wider business strategy and the wider business direction. So at Travelex, we try and follow jobs to be done. But before we go too much into jobs to be done, it's important to note that really an organization shouldn't have a singular process that it follows for product. Ultimately, you'll have different products serving different customers with different teams building the different products. And that means that a singular way of building products or a singular process isn't going to be fit for purpose, and you're going to end up running products and projects that are going to struggle because of processes you've put in place at an overarching level, which aren't ideal for the product. So whilst we do follow jobs to be done, that's not, that every product has to follow jobs to be done, or that we follow it to the book. We really take principles from a methodology like jobs to be done and then just try and apply them in the best way possible that makes sense for the product that we're working on. Jobs to be done hypothesizes that everybody hires a product to perform a job. So you might hire a car because you want to go from A to B. You hire money in the Travelex context. You hire the product of money because you want to transfer credit from one person to another person. And jobs to be done is all about understanding the job that you're trying to do and then understanding the outcomes that you want from that specific job. And then if you can understand the outcomes and you can identify underserved outcomes, so things that people are looking for in products and in the job that's underserved, then you can really create value. And I think there's a couple of practical examples. And if we look at McDonald's, so there was a survey ran for milkshakes at McDonald's in the US in Phoenix. And McDonald's wanted to improve sales of milkshakes. And classically, if you went to customers and said, how can we improve your milkshake experience, or what do you want from milkshakes? And they would have given you the classic things. They would have said, we want cheaper milkshakes and we want more flavors. Ultimately, those things are things that customers are always going to ask you for, and it's the classic Henry Ford thing of if Henry Ford would have asked customers what they wanted in the early 1900s, they would have told him a faster horse. No one would have told him to build a car because they just couldn't think beyond the current solution. So McDonald's wanted to sell more milkshakes. They wanted to try and understand what's going on. So the University of Phoenix came in and they worked with them, and they worked on understanding customer needs and understanding the job that a milkshake was going to do. And the first data point they took notice of was that most milkshakes were sold before 8 o'clock in the morning. I think it was over half of milkshakes were sold before 8 a.m., which was a really interesting data point. So they began to investigate that a little bit more. And they went and they spoke to customers and they did some research and insight. And rather than say to customers, what's the problem with your milkshake? How can we make your milkshake better? What they asked them was, if you didn't have that milkshake, what other products would you have had in its place? Or what role is that milkshake serving for you this morning? And they unpicked some really interesting outcomes where they found that customers had a long commute in the morning and they wanted something to occupy their hands. They just had a long drive. The drive was pretty boring, so they wanted something to do. But also they found that customers wanted something that sat on the stomach for a long time and saw them through till lunchtime so that they didn't snack throughout the day. And what was really interesting in that context is traditionally they would have thought that Burger King or Dunkin' Donuts were their milkshake competitors. And they actually found out that their milkshake competitors were a bagel or porridge or a banana. They were other products that were doing the same jobs that the customer wanted them to do. Other products that entertained their hands when they were driving, and other products that sat on their stomach for a long time. And ultimately, the way that McDonald's went around improving the milkshake was they made it thicker. And that's why McDonald's milkshakes today are like blobs of ice cream in a cup that take forever to drink, That's all because, you know, it satisfies the job of, it entertains your hands for longer, and it sits on your stomach because it's a lot thicker. So we try and follow jobs to be done. So when we think about money and currency, we try and understand the job that money's trying to do, the outcomes that people want from that job, and that's how we're really trying to revolutionize how people will send and spend money around the world.